Welcome back to Ice Beta, a podcast about ice climbing, mixed, and dry tooling. This is the first episode of Season 2, and like any good return after a hiatus, we've got some updates for you. That also means this intro will be a little longer than normal, so sit tight. On my end, I got married! Yay! Last season, you may have heard me mention that I was spending time in Slovenia, and now you know why. Currently, we're going through the process of getting my residency, which is complicated by the fact that the administrative unit is on full strike, full stop, as in no one is in the office kind of deal. So until that's sorted, I can't leave the country, and our joke is that I am now stuck in the most beautiful prison in the world. Could be a lot worse. For the podcast, we're doing things a little different this year. The season will be broken up into two parts. The spring-summer session will run from June to August and focused on dry tooling, with a little bit of ice climbing in there. While the fall-winter session will cover ice climbing and mixed, with a little bit of dry tooling in there, and run from November to March. If you maths that out, it's more episodes than last year, which is made possible thanks in part to our new sponsors, Anewho Gloves and Furnace Industries. I believe in what the companies stand for and use their products, so I'm thrilled to have their support. Their sponsorship has allowed me to do things like hire an editor, Andrew Solomon, who has been a great help already. So thank you very much, Andrew. I really appreciate it. Speaking of support, I also want to thank our patrons from Season 1, many of whom have backed the podcast since the very beginning. If you've been enjoying the podcast, consider becoming a patron yourself at patreon.com/icebeta. Now for today's episode, we're chatting with Kevin Lindlau, who is one of the rare birds in dry tooling who excels at both comp and outdoor climbing. In January, Kevin completed the second ascent of Aletheia, rated D16, becoming only the second person in the world to climb the grade. There's some nuance here since other routes have been proposed at D16, but this is the first route that has been repeated and the grade corroborated. Anywho, on the comp side, Kevin was the first American to ever make a World Cup finals in lead in 2019, and he has regularly made finals since. In this episode, we talk about how Kevin came to climbing after a gruesome accident that ended a promising bicycle racing career, the important role of mentorship in his development, big shout out to Marcus Garcia there, how to train for high-end roof climbing and competitions in the same year, the future of dry tooling routes, and of course, latte art. Just a warning that Kevin gives a graphic description of his accident. If you're squeamish, you might want to skip that part. If you're a sadist, well, I guess go ahead and enjoy yourself, you weirdo. We'll get to the interview shortly, but first, a quick message from our new sponsors. What do you get when you combine 30 years of ice climbing and product design chops? Well, if you're into gloves, you get Anewho, a boutique climbing brand on a mission to produce the best ice climbing and dry tooling gloves around. Doug, June, and the rest of the team spare no expense in the pursuit of durable, dexterous, and waterproof. Best yet, they are made from recycled textiles, which saves waste from the landfill, and they are robustly built so they won't end up there anytime soon. To learn more about your friend in the cold, head to anewho.com. That is ANIIU.com. We get it. For us, ice season never really ends. It just kind of blends between rock, plastic, and plywood until waterfalls freeze over again. No matter how you climb in the off-season, Furnace Industries keeps you going till your next bout of screaming barfies. With their gym-safe dry ice evolutions, you can keep up your fitness indoors. And if you like to challenge yourself on your home wall, they have the largest variety of dry tool holds in America. Check out their full lineup of ice and dry tooling gear at furnace-industries.com. Because for us, it's always ice season. So we started at talking about this, and your latte art is coming along.
I'm working on it. We're getting there. So this morning I was working on the Phoenix.
Oh, cool. Is this are you a barista?
No, I was working at a climbing gym and obviously climbing and training, so everything was just climbing and I needed like an out. So yeah, and I love coffee, and I kind of started going down the rabbit hole more and more. I'm like, oh, okay, well, latte art would be cool. And I tried it and it was so hard. I had no idea. And I just started watching all these YouTube videos and everything. And on Instagram, like all these people making it. And Yeah, I got really sucked in and went down the rabbit hole literally and trying to trying to learn. So I taught myself, but actually I just got a job at a coffee shop. So start next week, hoping to get better. And
yeah, because that's what I saw that post and I was like, oh, he works at a coffee shop and that's why he's doing it. But then Tyler, who's is going to be making an appearance several times in this episode, probably with questions from him, he said that you were super into coffee and now it's starting to click together. So I actually have been curious, but I've not been curious enough to take 5 minutes to YouTube it. How do you make latte art?
It's kind of crazy. It's way harder than I thought. So you have to make sure, one, your coffee beans are good and they're fresh. So that way you get a good crema when you make the espresso. And you need the crema to differentiate between the foam that's created on the milk that you're frothing. And it's really all about how you texture the milk. So if you like overheat it or over aerate it slightly, it kind of ruins it for latte art. So honestly, the biggest struggle is trying to get your milk right. And once you get that, you have to essentially mix the milk and the crema from your espresso together to a certain point to create a palette that the foam can actually float on top of the coffee. And you have to hit that kind of right. And it's all about pour rates. If you pour too fast, you create a sinkhole, then your design goes under. And if you pour it too quick, you end up just with a blob. So there's kind of a lot that goes into it. And depending on which design you have to do, you need to do different pour rates. You have to start at different points within the cup itself. You need more or less milk. Like there's quite a bit to it depending on which design. Like I said, I went deep down the rabbit hole. So sorry if I'm boring you with the, the technical parts of it.
Are you still at the point where I don't know if you ever take a thermometer to measure the temperature to get it right? Because I know that with food and cooking, you start to get a sense for these things. You know, there's a certain temperature at which point like olive oil in a frying pan like turns a shade and you know that it's like ready to start frying, for example. And there's like a certain time in the coffee roasting process when you can like smell that the beans are like starting to get ready. So I guess I'm like wondering, have you gotten to that Jedi level yet?
No, I wish. For that, I thought about doing a thermometer and everything, and I opted because like the goal was like, well, I want to work at a coffee shop, and that way I can like get better at it, you know, for a few months and just try to up the latte art game. So I decided to do it all by hand just because I figured I wouldn't have a thermometer there. So I was like, my friend, he came over and he used to do latte art. So he was kind of like explaining. So I definitely go off of feel. I'm always like, oh, okay, as soon as I start to feel the temp difference, like I'm starting to recognize when I need to change things, you know? And yeah, so I'm going purely off feel, but I have gone, like I said, the other side with like little timers and scales and trying to get the ratio right of extraction. Yeah, it's more to learn, but it's been a blast. Thermometer is next on the list, though, at some point.
I was getting into wine for a while. I enjoyed it because it was another sensory experience that you really deepen your appreciation for like nuance. So, you know, I was reading books about like flavor profiles and like how to evaluate it. And like just the way that you could even talk about it was really fun just as a forming like a mental picture of it. And it was really cool because I loved the interplay with rock climbing because the rock and the areas with which they're cultivated influences the flavors, obviously. And I was really excited for the future because it was like this whole new way that I was going to be able to explore travel. And then red wine started giving me headaches.
Oh no. Oh,
so I stopped doing that. It really is. And I wonder if you sort of have a similar like developing appreciation and understanding, and like, can you taste the terroir of different countries and places that you're getting beans from?
It is pretty fun because I've been experimenting with a bunch of different beans and things, you know, more on a low key level, like understanding what I like, but I finally can start to understand flavor profiles within the coffees. I think the tricky part is because I'm like self-brewing and stuff. If I botch like an extraction, you know, you're not getting the best out of those beans. So I'm starting to understand like how to get a proper extraction from a shot of espresso. And now I'm starting to finally get those different flavor notes that are described when you get them, which has been so fun. Like once you can start to do it right, you're like, whoa, this opens up a whole new world. And, you know, it's not just like a shot of espresso or a cup of coffee where you're like, oh, okay, this is just giving me some juice. Like I'm starting to like actually enjoy, you know, I'll just take a sip or two or like try to figure out how I can fine tune it to get more flavor out of each one and stuff. I'm beyond stoked to learn. Like the company I'll be working with now is like a coffee roaster, and they're very, very adamant about like the understanding of like where their beans are coming from. So I'm really excited. I know enough that I know nothing and I can't wait.
Yeah. You were dangerous and now you realize you're just ignorant.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't know if you want to keep talking about coffee. We
Oh,
could.
I could
Um,
forever. Dangerous game.
I probably will ask another coffee question. Just we'll see how we can work it in. I'm going to pivot a little bit, but actually, it's interesting because bicycle culture and coffee culture seem to really kind of intertwine. Maybe it's the European roots. I'm not quite sure. But another thing I learned is that you used to be a professional bicycle racer. Is that true?
Yeah, I was a junior, so I hadn't made it professional, but I was filling in for some UCI youth races like in Europe. And then I was also competing like La Tour de la Bidevie in Canada, which is one of the biggest youth UCI races you can do. So I was like racing at a higher level for sure. And I had done a couple of trips over to Europe to race. It was an absolute blast. And unfortunately, my last trip in Europe racing, I had a really bad crash that kind of ended my career goals for cycling. I tried to get back into it after the fact, and it just like the headspace wasn't there. And I started to venture out more and, find different sports.
Well, this is a podcast about ice climbing and dry tooling. So how did you end up transitioning from those endurance sports to this what you're doing is like incredibly power endurance based, but maybe we can go back to the beginning and how did you get into dry tooling?
It was funny. So as I mentioned, when everything fell apart for me in cycling, I really wanted to get back and become a professional cyclist. So I ended up looking at schools, like the top Division I schools for road racing. And I ended up finding myself at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. And my ambition was to race there and get back into the scene after that crash and get my headspace back. And it just never clicked again. Like it just really messed me up. So I was pretty lost for a while and I didn't know what to do. Is the first time in years I didn't have all this structure around me. Like I'm supposed to be training this many hours this day and yada yada. And it was like free time. And I was kind of going crazy actually. I had a real rough time with that. So I started like venturing out and I started climbing with some friends at our college. We had an outdoor program where I was able to go on backpacking trips. I started hiking in the mountains. I started slacklining a lot of trail running, downhill skiing. And in that outdoor program, it was really cool. They had an intro to ice climbing day. And I took advantage of that when I was a freshman at college there. It was amazing. I absolutely loved it. We went out for the whole day, never ice climbed before, went to some beautiful falls, and that really hooked me. So I kind of started over time buying my own gear and borrowing stuff from our outdoor program and got into ice itself. And the next year or two, I got really into rock climbing. I met some friends who wanted to start a collegiate team because there was the USA Climbing collegiate circuit going on. And I just wanted something to train for. And I got hooked. All my time I was spending was like rock climbing videos, like how to train, how to get better. And my friends were really, really talented. And they started like teaching me and I'd go with them. We were learning. Through all this, I was still ice climbing in the winters. I went to the Ouray Ice Festival and I saw the Ouray mixed climbing competition for the first time. And I was blown away. I was like, what? This is insane. They're like mixing all this rock climbing competition style with these crazy hanging volumes. And at the time they had all these logs and stuff hanging up on the wall. It was just nuts. And I was like, I want to do that. So I went back to that place where I learned to ice climb and there was like some M4 mixed climb there. And I remember trying it and I couldn't get 2 moves off the ground. I kept falling. Like I had to fall like 20 times. I was like, I don't understand. This is witchcraft. It makes no sense. When I went back, I was climbing at the gym and we had just started that collegiate team and Marcus became our coach and he was kind of sponsoring our team. And I was telling him about it and he's like, oh, I used to do that, like those competitions, like I could show you. And just from there, he kind of took me under his wing and we started along this path where he was telling me then that he had ambitions of starting the Youth USA ice climbing team. And myself and Liam Foster and a couple other kids, we ended up becoming the first kids of this team. And yeah, so grateful Marcus took us all under his wing and started mentoring us. So it was just kind of funny, like just chatting, like, oh, I saw this. And he's like, oh yeah, it was unexpected, but very grateful for how that all turned out.
We're going to talk a lot more about Marcus and your time with him, but I was wondering about where you were after the bicycle crash and with the headspace.
It was pretty rough. At first I was just lost. I needed something to train for. And I think a lot of athletes, like you put a lot of stake into your sport and it becomes your identity. When I couldn't bike race at the same level, I felt like I was pretty worthless. Like all of my self-worth of what I had invested and thought myself to be, I'm a cyclist. This is what I do. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I felt destroyed. I felt embarrassed. I was like, well, I can't do it at the same level I was doing it at. Like, I don't belong here now. And I ended up getting really depressed, and it led down kind of a bad path for a bit. And it was pretty rough. I just needed structure. I mean, I used to ride before school when I was in high school. I'd get done with school and I'd go ride and train all night. Like, I always had some sort of structure, and all of a sudden that structure was gone. And it's pretty demoralizing when you're trying to do something and you can't get back to where you were. Yeah. You're like, I know I was able to do this. Why can't I do it now? And it just makes you more and more frustrated. And I kept getting more and more depressed. I was like, this isn't working.
Was the recovery, you just weren't able to get back to like physical peak performance?
It was more mental. It was pretty rough. I ripped from the bottom of my chin, across my chin, up through my nose, down to the bone. All my teeth on the top all got broken out. Like, I have no bone left under my nose, and that would be holding all my upper teeth in. I ripped a square inch on my cheek down to the bone, like a huge hole there, and chunk of my nose got ripped off and open. And like, I ended up finding like a bunch of pieces of my teeth, and my face just kind of like split open and peeled back side to side. It was weird. Like, when you would talk, it was like talking with four lips and big inch long hole through my tongue. And I got really, really lucky. I was in Belgium at the time, and a teammate I was training with, he helped me out a ton, and they were able to put me back together. I got so lucky. When I was coming into the hospital, a plastic surgeon from England had flown in that day for a meeting. And as he was walking out, I was coming in, and he saw me, and he stayed and did my surgery for me. So I think they stopped counting after 150 stitches. And like, my face was so mangled, it kind of looked like Zoidberg, and they couldn't put it together. It was so messed up. So they had to like cut about 4 millimeters of skin off everything just to even be able to have something to work with to sew it back together. Yeah, it was kind of gnarly. So he stayed, he did the surgery, and I got so lucky. They thought I was going to have internal like brain pressure and stuff, and like my face be smashed in and everything. And luckily the soft tissue took most of the damage, and they sewed a chunk of my nose back together. So it looks normal, but that's why I got all these scars and holes all over my face. It's from bike racing. And it was the least painful crash I've ever had. Like, adrenaline was just going, but it was pretty bizarre.
Oh my gosh.
No bueno.
Okay.
But it was, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that helps provide a lot more perspective for what you were dealing with recovery. So you were getting into dry tooling, which can be dangerous in its own right. I mean, I guess I never really pieced together how dangerous bicycling could be, but obviously you're going really fast around sharp corners. And so you're getting into dry tooling. Were you experiencing any mental hesitations when you were getting into that?
Yes and no. I think, dry tooling's funny. And I was very fortunate because a lot of my learning, so I had been ice climbing for, I think, 2 years at this point when I was getting into it. For some reason, it wasn't as scary, but I think to premise it, like, I wasn't getting very high up on routes because I was really bad. So like, I wasn't getting that exposure fear and things like that. Marcus, because he started teaching us, we started learning in the gym, and that takes away a lot of the exposure, and it gives you a better understanding of how tools and your picks function on the rock. And you get a better understanding inside of how to use your tools exponentially quicker than outdoors. Because outdoors, you're fighting all these different fear aspects. You don't know what you're grabbing. You have the fear of falling, obviously the exposure and stuff. And I think that helped a lot to round out that curve of like the fear that goes along with it. Because when Marcus and I started going outside more, I had a better understanding of how to use my equipment and what it should feel like when I'm on holds. So that mitigated a lot of that initial fear, I think, that people have. So I was very lucky that we had a facility that I could train in and learn at, and Marcus was willing to show me that. But it definitely was scary. Like, I'd get up above cliffs and things. I'm like, oh God, like, I don't know if I'm going to pop or not. And I guess the beauty of mixed climbing as opposed to rock climbing is like, rock, you can feel like you're like, oh no, my grip's going, like I'm sliding off the hold. And mixed climbing, you're just like, oh, I'm in the air. I don't know what happened. It's kind of like over. Yeah. I think once I got more comfortable with that, it wasn't bad. So there was a lot of fear that was associated with it, but not so much in the way I think a lot of people experience it at the start. And more or less, that's because of Marcus and his teachings early on.
Was his approach to training you in the gym first, was that sort of unique at the time? Because for context, the strongest comp climbers today and for the past few years have all trained with him. And so he's doing something different. His approach is distinct, at least in the US. How does Marcus approach it that might sort of set the youth climbers up for success in other ways than maybe you've seen from other coaches or mentors? Like, does he have a secret sauce?
Yeah, and there's a few things that I think are worth mentioning about this, and it kind of goes back a little ways to when we started the USA Youth Ice Climbing team. When I started with Marcus and this all kind of was getting going, Marcus hadn't been competing in ice climbing competitions for a few years, and things changed a lot really rapidly. So he had been training me for a year, and then I ended up going and doing my first like major competition. When I got there, things were totally different. It was like completely different level of anything we had been training. I kind of left with my tail between my legs and was shut down. And, it was cool though, because it was motivating. I was like, whoa, okay, I've got a lot of work to do and I want to get better at this. And I came back and kind of shared what I learned and what was different with Marcus. And he was able to adapt really quickly. Like he had an understanding of what I was talking about. We like changed holds. We worked together to like figure out the moves that were kind of on the routes. And we watched videos of the comps and things to understand what the new movements and stuff were. Traditionally, at this point, most people, specifically in North America, to get strong for competition ice climbing at that time, like what you did was you go outside and you climb for real. And then you go, and they're totally different sports. Competition ice and dry tooling is like way different. You oftentimes don't find any of that movement outside. It can be found, but it's like not very common. And people usually stay off of routes that are like that. When we were working together, Marcus was able to adapt and start to experiment with different rock climbing training methods that he was using and transition them into dry tooling. He started to understand that dry tooling competitions were switching more from like the technical abilities to the physical abilities and mixing the two of them. It's half and half. It's half a skill sport, half a strength sport. So we started to adapt all this rock climbing training that was kind of experimental at the time and push it to dry tooling. And I think that's where we ended up hitting kind of the sweet spot with it. Like Marcus was ahead of the curve there where people were still just like, I'm going to go do this dry tooling route outside and that should set me up for this comp. And it just didn't. You had to start mixing the new IFSC bouldering and sport climbing styles with dry tooling now. And that requires a different type of training. You have to be doing strength training, power endurance, all of these different things, grip training, like core, it was just so much different. So we took it more to a physical level, kind of like gymnastics than we did going out. And I think that touches on the other thing too. Marcus was amazing because if you look at a lot of coaches now, especially that rock climbing is exploding all over, you can see all these gyms have teams, which is awesome, but they only practice inside. And Marcus realized that it's not just like the competition side of things. We need that skill side of things too. And he was willing to spend his weekends and his free time. He would take us and the whole team, like we'd always go out and we'd go actually like climb outside and do it for real. During the weeks when we all had school and stuff, we'd be in the gym. We had a training plan. Like he had us doing our workouts and stuff together. And he'd come in with us and was like working very heavily on like body position, technique, like what's going wrong. He'd videotape us and figure out like what was happening. So we'd really dial in like the fundamentals. But then we'd go outside and we'd apply it. Then you're starting to get the outdoor skills. And that's something, I mean, even now in rock climbing, so many of these kids that are coming up, it's awesome. These teams exist, but like, no one's like actually mentoring them. It's just a team, right? So they're not going out and practicing it necessarily for real. And it's kind of unfortunate to see. And I think that will have to change at some point. But I think that's where Marcus was really ahead of the curve. He was able to like understand these things that were changing. He was able to modify and change his training, make it so we could work on the skill practice and put it all together. And that's like not possible without a mentor. And it was more so he was a mentor than a coach.
What does a mentor look like for you?
A mentor isn't just like a coach where they're like there just for you for your training and they dip out and you don't talk to them again until you come back to train. Like a mentor is a friendship too. Marcus is a great example of this. He wanted nothing in return. He purely wanted to share his love of the sport and the passion for it with us. And we would offer him like, hey, can we pay you for your training? So he's just like, no, like, let's go have fun. We're going to go out and climb. It was like a friendship. And so a mentor isn't just a coach. And I think that's where I want to differentiate it. It's a friendship and it's a two-way path too. Like a mentor mentoring a mentee, like the mentee doesn't necessarily have to be someone completely new at it. It could just be someone that doesn't have that skill set and you're like working together. So a mentorship can be a two-way path as well. For example, like I'm working with a younger climber here in Bozeman, Montana. His name's Wilson. he's exceptionally strong rock climber, and he's into this whole new modern style of competition rock climbing where they're doing all this crazy dynamic stuff. And I don't know that. So I can teach Wilson all these other things, but at the same time, I'm the mentee to him. He's like teaching me so much about all these like crazy running things. And half the time I think he's trying to kill me with some of these moves, but it's cool. Yeah, it's a two-way path. And I think a lot of people are hesitant to become a mentor because they're worried. They're like, oh, it's going to hurt my climbing. Like, I'm not going to get out. Like, I'm going with this noob who doesn't know what's up. It's not that. And I think you want to look at more of like a friendship relationship rather than just like, I'm teaching you. And a mentor has so many effects, not only on the sport that you're doing, but your life. Marcus has helped guide me in so many ways just through my general life, not just in climbing. Like, we have a very close relationship now. Like, we still go on trips all the time together. We hang out together. He's coming up and I'm still always learning from Marcus. Like, it was really fun. I learned some new things this last week when we were bolting a route together, and it's just fantastic. So it ends up building hopefully these lifelong friendships, and it's very cool.
You talked about how he was teaching you some things for bolting, because you guys just bolted what you named Bellissimo. What was that experience like working with him on that?
It was a blast. Actually, years and years ago, Marcus taught me how to bolt when I lived in Durango, Colorado. That's something that's like hard to learn, and it's extremely dangerous if people just go out and do it without any form of knowledge. Like, that's not something you want to just watch a video on YouTube and go for it, because like people's lives are in your hands, you know?
It's not the same as creating latte art.
Yeah. I think that's differentiate the YouTube knowledge there. You know, it's cool to like learn a little bit, but there's so much that goes into it, understanding like rock types and cleaning. Marcus showed me so much. Like, I had no idea what went into establishing a route. And years ago, he was able to kind of show me that, and I was able to work on it. And at the time, it was cool. I was able to apply that into my high lining and everything, and put up new like high lines with friends and stuff. And then I started to transition more putting up routes when I moved to Bozeman, Montana. So that way I could have some more things to train on. This one was great because I hadn't actually put up a mixed route. I've only done dry tooling routes before that I've established, specifically sport dry tooling routes. So this was really fun because I had this vision of linking up this huge ice pillar that grows in the back of the cave. And it's an absolutely beautiful pillar back there. It's very aesthetic. And on the far outside of the cave is one of the most famous dry tooling routes in Highlight called Panama Canal. I was like, you know what? I bet you could go up that ice pillar and finish there. Like, so I ended up bolting a link up there to connect it. And I bolted everything. I got things kind of prepped before Marcus came to Bozeman to help me out. But there was things like I wasn't sure of. I hadn't had to deal with. So when I was coming out of the cave and going onto this face, the shape of the rock and everything was like slightly different than I thought. There was all these like horns underneath, and how the rope ran over this barrel on the rock. It was like messing with me. And I actually core shot my rope super bad while I was on it. Like, it cut through like some of the core strands, like completely cut the sheath. It was pretty gnarly. So I had to like clip into a draw quick and pull some rope and tie a knot and like lower off of that. And I was like, well, that really messes with my head now. Like, I don't want to take a whip here and die. And Marcus was able to kind of come in and show me how he mitigates certain things, like where the rope was running. We worked for 2 days trying to like clean out different rock. Like, so, I mean, we were cleaning the garbage rock that was dangerous for rockfall for individuals below, but then we were trying to like figure out where we needed to extend things so the rope wouldn't run over certain areas and all this. And it was like a lot that I hadn't considered. Usually I just climb in caves and you don't have to worry about that. Transitioning onto a face like this, it was really cool. Marcus has all that knowledge from establishing routes all over the world. And it was really fun to get to see and work with him on that. And I feel like I have a better understanding now after watching Marcus work up there as well. There's always something to be learned.
What's interesting about Team USA ice climbing is that there haven't been that many athletes, and many still compete, actually. And like, people will even take years off and then come back. And so there doesn't seem to be a lot of retired athletes to sort of play a mentorship role. And maybe that's inaccurate. Well, maybe I just ask, like, would you say that's accurate? Like, are former Team USA athletes, are they playing coaching and mentorship roles?
Yeah, there definitely are. And, you know, it is kind of funny. I've been doing competition ice climbing for about 10 years now. When I started, there was a whole nother generation of climbers. The USA ice climbing team actually hit its quota. My first competition, man, that must have been 2015, I think. We actually had a full team at that time, but then almost all of them retired that season. Like Kendra Stritch, Carter Stritch, and myself were the only ones remaining the next year. It was like, whoa. So this whole generation of like all these comp climbers all of a sudden just were done. And it was like, okay. So we kind of had this rebuilding phase. So it was weird. So I think a lot of people look back the last couple of years and they're like, well, the team was small, and it actually used to be pretty big. It just hit this weird phase of everyone retiring. And amongst those people, there's super strong climbers. For example, Chris Snowbeck, who's one of the other prominent leading drytoolers in North America, was like part of the team, and a couple other climbers that were on the team. And they were helping coach and mentor some younger climbers at the time. I think now people have kids and work and other things have happened, and they're no longer as available for kind of like doing the mentorship side of things and stuff. But there was some of that going on. And some of those members, as you mentioned, are still competing, and some are like retired, but not so much in like the mentorship role, but they're trying to push the sport and grow the sport in other ways. So for example, like Angela Limbach and Kendra Stritch are pushing really hard to grow the sport in the Midwest. So they've been hosting a lot of competitions there, trying to get more engagement within the community there, which is awesome. So, they're pushing the sport, but in a different way, as opposed to like mentorship and trying to teach new climbers in the next generation. They're doing a bit of that too, but I think more of the focus recently has been on that. So yeah, it's funny. They're still stewards of the sport for sure. And I think as time goes on, like Tyler Kempney's a great example. When he was climbing at the Ice Coop in Boulder, Colorado, was coaching heavily, and they started a team there. So he was sharing his knowledge and things there, which is huge. So there are some of us that are teaching, and a lot of us have taken it upon ourselves. Like Keenan, for example, he started out on the youth US team with us, and his first youth world championships was in France years ago. Marcus and I went as coaches, and it was so fun. This year, I went with one of the newer climbers I'm mentoring to France again for the Youth World Championships. And Keenan was able to join me and help coach there. So it was kind of like a full circle moment. He had progressed from youth competitions. He's competing at the top level in World Cups. And now he's back and coaching at the same event he started. So that was like really, really fun to see. So I think even though people aren't retired, they're still trying to help and grow the sport and grow the next generation. And that's really, really fun to see.
Well, so you've been performing at a really high level in comp climbing and in outdoors as well, to the extent where you actually just did the second ascent of what is now agreed upon to be the hardest dry tooling route in the world, Aletheia. Could you talk about like what that route is?
So I guess starting off, like the route itself is pretty nuts. Matteo ended up sending it just over 2 years prior to me going and trying the route. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of kickback within like the Italian dry tooling community, it sounds like. And I don't know exactly everything that went on, but it didn't necessarily get the recognition that you would expect a route at that caliber to get, which was unfortunate. I had been talking with Matteo. I had met him once at a competition, and we climbed together a little bit on a future trip I did to Italy, and we started to get a little closer then. It was really fun because one of my prior trips to Italy, I was working in another cave called Tomorrow's World on some other routes. I was working on A Line Above the Sky, which was the first D15 ever in our sport. That trip while I was there, Matteo had recently just finished his route, and a video came out and showcasing what he had done. And we watched the video one night, and I was like, whoa, that's super cool. And it was only an hour and a half from where we were staying. So we ended up meeting up with Matteo and going and checking it out in person. And I was like, holy crap. The cave that we are climbing in Tomorrow's World is massive. It's just this huge, huge roof. And this one, it didn't put it to shame, but it's pretty dang massive. And it's a different style. It's actually like in a cave, and it's actually a man-made cave from the Middle Ages when they used to have the stone wheels for grinding grain down. They used to use a lot of softer stone. So everyone had really bad teeth because the sand would get into the bread once they baked it, and it's trashing everyone's teeth. Well, this rock in this hill, it was stronger. It didn't do that, and it wouldn't break apart. So they ended up, you can see actually in the cave, all like the chisel marks from them digging out the rock. So it's really cool. So it's a man-made cave. There's an old castle that used to be above it too. So it's just like this really bizarre place. So literally like 20 feet through the rock above you is like castle ruins. Anyways, this cave that they created, or this quarry, it ends up being between 65 and 70 meter roof from the back. Matteo created Aletheia to start at the very, very back of the cave, and it climbs out dead center through the entire thing. It's a mix of natural and manufactured holds. Some of the rock is atrocious and like in conglomerate and needed some manufacturing, so that way the route would stay the same. Other spots he was able to maintain more of the natural features. However, in this route, it was quite different than what the hardest routes at the time had been. Parallel World, which was now a D15 plus, was one of the 4 proposed D16s at the time, and the other 3 have all since been downgraded. Mateo was able to go and climb parallel world, I think on his third attempt. People just were like, okay, this isn't the level. Like, it's hard. You climb a D10 up to the roof. It's about 20 meters there. Then I think it's another like 35 meters of roof to get to the end of parallel world. And it has big moves at the start, one big move at the end, but there's foot options everywhere on the route. Like, you could rest and shake out 7 or 8 times with like feet on in the roof. So it gives you all this opportunity to recover throughout the route. Mateo's route differed in the fact that there was very few options to ever get feet on. And not only that, you start in a figure 4 and you climb to the end of the route in the roof for 65 meters straight through. There's one rest about 40 meters in where you get feet on and your body's at like not quite parallel to the ground. You're kind of like can shake out and rest, but it's hard. It's not easy. With that, there's other like aspects. The movement was really hard. There was competition style movement in it. I think for people to understand, there's 2 general categories of dry tooling technique. There's what we would call Llaneros or figure 4 nines. And then there is another form called DTS, which stands for dry tooling style. And it's also referred to as French style. That's where you don't utilize figure 4s and figure 9s. Usually people are purist in one or the other. They only like to use figure 4 nines or do DTS climbing. It was really fun. Mateo was able to make this route in a way that you couldn't just figure 4-9 it. You couldn't just DTS it. You had to use both skills to get through it. And that's huge. I think that's very futuristic in the sport. And it made the route very difficult. There was like floating underclings and things that you would see in competition climbing that were on this route, which was sick. I loved it. And it made the route more challenging. And that was a step up from anything else I believe that's been done. So that was one of the considerations I took in confirming his grade. The second parameter was that at this time, all of the routes, like they were long, but the roof was double of what anything else was. So for one, it had harder moves at the start, and 2, it was twice as long of a roof section. So that seemed to justify it for me. And it was just like a total endurance test piece. So I think like there, based on those parameters that we've been basing dry tooling grades off of, it seemed justifiable. If it's harder than the other hardest route in the world at the moment, in those 2 categories, it seems logical to give next grade. And I'm curious as more people climb the route to see what they hear. But I do think this was like a step up. And as other people have mentioned, Mateo didn't give the grade lightly. I think noting that he was able to flash a line above the sky. He was able to do parallel world, which at the time is like the next hardest route, 15 plus, third try. Like, and this took him months to train for and do. And Aletheia also has a fear factor to it. You're very close to the ground. With this, at the choke point of the route, you're actually only about 10 feet off the deck. So you have to do 2 rope changes. So you climb on 3 separate ropes throughout. And it's not because the route's so long, you could theoretically do it in 1 rope length. But because of the rope stretch, if you're to fall and you have that much rope out, you're going to deck 100%. Even with rope switches, I was hitting the ground when I would fall. So it was pretty concerning. So you had to be like really on top of your head game, being like, okay, I'm committed to this move so I don't die. Like, it was definitely concerning.
Do you see comp climbing continuing to influence outdoor routes at the highest grade? I mean, you basically said as much, but I guess I'm curious, like, where else might those contributions come into play? You mentioned floating underclings and then switching between DTS and figure 4s and things like that.
I think it will to an extent. Ironically, a lot of the competition climbers don't do a lot of outdoor dry tooling like at an upper level. It's kind of rare, actually, because they are very different sports and you have to train very differently for them. And vice versa, a lot of outdoor dry toolers don't do competition climbing because it's such a different world. So there are only a few of us that actually do both. That being said, all the things from competition climbing already exist outside. I don't think it's necessarily like influencing and changing it. I think it's giving people a better understanding of what they can do with the tools and the rock. So it exists now. It's just people need to recognize it and see it outdoors. So for example, the new route that we just put up in Bozeman called Bellissimo, it was really cool. In the roof, there was like a yanga, which is a hook. And it's essentially where you turn your tool and your pick parallel to the rock. And there's like a tiny little horn that's no more than a centimeter tall. And you just hook your pick sideways over it, kind of like a coat hanger, you know? And if you pull out on it, it pops, but there was no other usable holds there. So this is like something that you would see in a comp though. And like we were able to recognize it just because of like the experiences we have with that. So I think the comp climbing, it gives you a greater view of what you can actually do with the rock. So I do expect to see more of that style movement coming into play as people recognize it now and can see how they can utilize the rock features. Some things I do think are going to transfer. For example, knowing, and this comes to understanding and recognizing the rock, sometimes there's these big blank sections and people are able to do comp style movement and skip these sections now and do these like super cool moves like I had mentioned Matteo doing. And I do believe that that is going to become more prevalent as well in outdoor dry tooling. People are starting to recognize it, and dynos and stuff. I think that's going to make a move into it. Like I have ambitions, and there's some spots like getting through some flank sections with some jumps. One of the more popular dry tooling caves, Lucine in France, like had a route with a big dyno on it. Like I think we'll start to see more of that as the sport develops, especially with the younger generation coming in and everything being so dynamic. That's a whole new world that most of us wouldn't even consider doing with tools. And these guys are like, it's nothing for them. Like no fear. They're like, oh yeah, I can jump to that. The thing's just like a ledge. Sure. I got this. And I think that's going to start to come into play as well.
Do you think this might sort of parallel the advancement from aid climbing to free climbing, where drilling and manufacturing holds? Like if you have a blank spot or a spot that really just not conducive to holds, and you can make a big move out, is that sort of the equivalent?
Yeah, it's a tricky question because I think there are places. So that cave, for example, Lucine, it was in a quarry and the rocks were so smooth. One, you couldn't rock climb there. You couldn't dry tool there. Like there was nothing, no features. So they took this blank canvas basically, and they made the moves how they wanted them to be. So they have these weird comp style moves, like I was mentioning, some of the dynos and weird stuff they do there. Like that's completely artificial manufactured, but because it wasn't conducive to rock climbing or dry tooling, they just like made it happen. I think there's a push to go back towards natural climbing now. I think there was a lot of manufacturing that was going on prior to make the rock climbable for the people's level that were establishing it. I think now we're starting to understand, well, now that people are stronger, we can do these bigger reaches and this more technical movement that can get us past some of these blank spots and cruxes. So for example, the cave and highlight that I've been working in is all natural. And you're having to utilize now all these techniques and get through these blank sections using strength and being dynamic in like the roof and on the head walls, as opposed to like, oh, I can't reach it. I need to add something here so I can make it happen, and like not necessarily bringing the rock down to your level. That being said, there are times and places where I do think from a safety standpoint, it is beneficial to have enhanced holds and things. And another thing to consider is it keeps the route the same too, because dry tooling, primarily crampons, but picks over time can wear like little notches in the rock and stuff. And things break off. There's a lot of leverage going on. When things are natural, the rock breaks off, the holds break, then the route becomes different. And it's not the same as when it was first put up. So I think some scenarios and some rock, when it's really crappy, like enhancing a natural feature so that it's going to last and not be dangerous and rip off on someone, but also keep the route the same. And it's also going to mitigate people like reaching around and scratching up the rock everywhere. Like, I think there's benefits to it for sure. I think it has to be done tastefully. And obviously it comes down to the ethics of the area that you're climbing in. Like, if that's not cool, don't do it. Like in that area for highlight, for example, it's not acceptable to like drill pockets and things. It's meant to be done naturally. But, you know, if you go to Europe and, you know, some of the crags are just straight up drilled pockets everywhere, like their ethics are different, and then it's acceptable. And you just have to be aware of that. And I think there's ups and downs to it all. And some are for safety things. It's really cool to have these routes that are not so much the technical side of it, where you're like, oh, I can hang on this little edge and stuff and like do this. And some are just cool because they're just like, can you physically do the moves and can you hang on? And it's fun. It's two different styles and it's cool. It's a neat way for people to progress. And I enjoy climbing that style. It's great. And I love both styles. So I think having a healthy mix of both of those is great.
Matteo, when talking about, because he didn't give the grade lightly, as you mentioned, that there should be sort of this paradigm shift. And the way you described it basically makes it sound like the form has changed to the way that this route is established with so many different styles involved. Do you have a concept of what like a D18 or D19 would look like?
Yeah, I do. I think it's going to go more towards, I think it's going to start to utilize, as we talked about, more comp style movement. And I think it's going to require complete body tension in the routes. So a lot of DTS routes at the moment, so not requiring figure 4s and 9s, it's totally by choice. You could figure 4 or 9 the routes if you wanted and get through them. It's purely done for a style point of view, where I think as the sport continues to grow, so like on Matteo's route, 2 of these moves weren't necessarily physically possible to do with figure 4 or 9s, and they had to be done that way. So it was forced beta. And I think eventually having routes in these roofs on like more of this natural terrain that is only physically possible to do it in that style is going to be where it trends. And that's what's going to make it difficult. Same as rock climbing, the progression came from more difficult movement. Like if you look at bouldering, for example, it's just a lot of body tension on these gnarly holds. It's low percentage. And I think that's what Drytooling is going to switch to. And not only that, it's going to start to have more dynamic movement with lower percent holds. And I think this was a good route to start to see what that looked like, the lower consequence level. As like I mentioned, the younger generation comes up and they have obviously larger ambitions and understanding of what's possible with tools now. I think they're going to start to incorporate that into their route development as they grow as climbers. And I'm really excited to see where it goes. I do think that there's some issues right now with our grading in that in our sport, traditionally, as routes got longer, they got harder grades. And that was something that Matteo was very against. And just making it longer doesn't necessarily, it makes it harder because you have to hang on longer. But at some point, you can train to where you can just hang on forever, right? So you have to find a different gauge of difficulty in the climb. And that's what he was able to obtain by having these forced moves that are like super body tensiony compy and things that don't allow you just to like figure 4-9 through them. And the problem with this too, our grading scale at the time, when it was being established, was only given pluses and minuses. So you have two categories within each grade. Rock climbing for the Yosemite decimal system has A, B, C, D. I think Drytooling needs to make a shift at some point. I don't know exactly what the proposed new grading scale would be, but at the moment, for example, Matteo's route, it went from 15 plus to D16. And then his new route, because he's going along the trend of like the traditional grading pattern, the only place to go, it's harder. It's definitely a step up from the route he just did. So the only place for it to go is a plus, which means the next grade is going to be 17 or 17 minus. And that progression is too fast. Like we can't jump a whole grade that quick. Like it doesn't make sense unless it truly is, that hard. But like, I think eventually there's going to need to be a switch now at the higher level. And it's not so much a problem of, if it is harder, just give it a bigger number. But I think there needs to be more of a fine-tuned grading scale. So like having like A, B, C, D, I don't think a whole half grade shift in a route when it's actually not that much more difficult, it's only like 2 or 3 moves, is necessarily deserving of a plus. I think like it might be like, oh, this was D15A and this one's D15B. I think we can get more refined is what I'm trying to say. I think the younger generation has a great opportunity to change things and make these decisions and kind of determine where the sport's going to go. But Matteo's done a great job, I think, so far in lighting the way in the new direction for the sport.
Quick question. Is Katie going to start comp climbing?
Oh man, I'm trying to get her to.
Yeah. She'd crush.
Yeah, she would do amazing. She has more of a focus right now still on outdoor objectives and projects. So I think her focus for the time being is that. But who knows, maybe in the future, try to get her down to year A or something and see if she enjoys comp climbing to begin with. Because she comes from horse riding competition background. And I think she wanted a little break from the competition side of things and to enjoy more of like interpersonal like objectives and goals. And she's climbing so strong outdoors. It's so fun to watch. And her progression, just since we started Drytooling together years ago, and she was just learning how to like use tools and rock to like, now she's the first American woman to climb D15. It's pretty outstanding. So she has so much potential in the sport, and I am beyond stoked to see what she does with it. And I hope I can talk her into doing a comp at some point in time.
You've talked about how mentorship has been so important in your life and how that's something that you want to give back to the sport. So obviously you're mentoring Katie, and I actually don't know the name of the youth climber that you went to France with this past year, but so you are engaging in that regard. How are you, maybe just in the context of like working with Katie, like how are you working with her in terms of like training and things like that she's been able to have such a rapid rise? Like, I don't know how much climbing experience she had before, but I mean, obviously you were able to sort of take like experience that Marcus imparted upon you, your own development and things like that. And I imagine you've been able to like build on and evolve your own training as well.
Katie's become my roof training partner and outdoor training partner. And Wilson Whitley is the younger climber I've been mentoring for competition climbing. And he is my competition training partner. So it's kind of fun. We actually like split up because the training is so different. Because of that, I have to focus and like plan out when my comp season's coming up. I have to switch my training. And when I'm doing outdoor stuff, I have to revert back to a different style of training. So I think starting off with Katie, and the outdoor style of training. It was great. I think Katie's a phenomenal ice climber prior to dry tooling and still is. And she was also a very talented rock climber. However, getting into dry tooling, it's kind of like a different sport all in itself. So we started out, her ambition was just to start doing training for the ice season beforehand, maintaining strength and stuff. So we started dry tooling together. And as she got more and more into it, she started to have this like focus shift where she wanted to start focusing on dry tooling objectives and even in the winter. So it was fun. We started working together in the gym, learning more of the techniques, and then ended up inviting them on one of my Italian trips to go back to Tomorrow's World. And they were like super stoked, her husband. And we all started to train together. This goes back to the different style of training for outdoor climbing. And for dry tooling specifically, we're climbing these big roofs. And I started to research more and develop more training for roof climbing that was heavily worked on with Marcus as well. Marcus and I would go back and forth. So the first year, Marcus helped me develop a plan for this kind of stuff. And it was very experimental, had no clue if it was really going to work or not. There's very few people doing this roof stuff at the higher level. And all of us train differently. I'm friends with them all and we all chatted and everyone's done it in a different way. So Marcus ended up writing a plan that was kind of in his own form, right? He was able to kind of develop from rock climbing and some ice climbing training. He mixed all these things and it was cool. I blindly went into it with him and we didn't know exactly what would happen, but it worked out great. So taking from that, Marcus being super busy, I was starting to write some of my own plans for the next year. And then I would run them by Marcus to make sure they made sense and he would make changes. So I just want to premise that most of this training is done by Marcus and his knowledge. And I've kind of developed it since then with him. So it's a combo of our training, but it was all experimental. And I got Katie on the plan too, and Joe. And it was actually interesting because we were using us almost as data points, an experiment to see what would happen. So all three of us did this experimental training the last 2 years. And it was pretty amazing to see we actually had great consistency between all of us and the data points now and the progression that we made. So I think we found a great training plan that helps us to train for that. That being said, sorry, deviating a little bit here. The outdoor training is more focused on endurance climbing. And the route I was working on, Aletheia, was having to have a combo of power endurance that you would refer to in rock climbing, as well as just endurance and hanging out for a long time. But it actually started to focus more on our aerobic climbing system. The routes were so long. I think most of these routes were almost a half an hour plus, 30 to 40 minutes of climbing upside down in the roof, hanging on one hand. And it was hilarious because I actually wasn't getting pumped anymore, with the training that we were doing. But ironically, my muscles would just fail. They wouldn't work anymore. I'd run out of ATP, muscles wouldn't close. I was like, what? So how did I really start to think about nutrition? And nutrition played a huge, huge role in this. I had to think about, okay, well, in the morning, I have to eat this protein at this time, and then hour and a half, 2 hours before, I'm eating these slow burning carbs, so it hits when I'm actually giving my attempts, and then 20 minutes before, I have these fast burning carbs, so I have instant energy plus some caffeine in there. I really had to start to play, and I would take magnesium supplements, help with ATP production and all these things. I had to really focus on nutrition and start to learn that. And that made the biggest difference, actually. My muscles started to function longer. I could get through this easier and rest. And all this training that we had done, the goal was to essentially get ourselves to, if anyone's familiar with arc training, where you climb for a long period of time on a wall and try to force high blood pressure into your forearms to create new blood vessels and pathways within your forearms so you can get more oxygen there and clear out all the gunk that's happening. The goal was to eventually be able to do that in the roof. And I think we're at a point now where I'm actually able to do that. I can do 40-minute burns upside down and figure 4 nines if I want. And that was part of my training getting here. But that took years to build up to. The training.
That is so much.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty crazy. And it was cool. But a lot of that came from methodical training. When Marcus and I were developing the plan, a lot of it came from I was doing a lot of hangboarding, grip strength training, physical strength training. There was a lot of intervals that led up to that, base training to make sure your body could take the stress and the loads of time under tension that we were getting to. And there was a lot going into it. It not only happened in 1 year, but we had to build up year to year to year. So it's interesting. But with that, it's a lot of slow climbing. So we talked about the aerobic energy system and how this was focusing more on the nutrition side of things and stuff, kind of going and running a marathon. So you need to make sure that your body was functioning in an aerobic capacity or system. So like that meaning that your muscles are being fueled off of oxygen intake rather than using like quick sugars, essentially, unless you had like a quick power endurance section to get through. And this is so much different than competition training. Competition climbing, you have to climb super fast. They give you like, okay, you got 4 minutes. You have to go do these crazy hard moves in that time. You're not going to pump out because it's only 4 minutes. So like just go and like rampage. So for competition style training, we're doing super fast timed like intervals on routes. We'll time it out. You have 6 to 8 seconds if you want to be competitive per hold. And you need to be able to figure it out on the fly. And it's all these body tensioning moves. So your body's just getting worked and you're like going into your anaerobic threshold. And that is focusing more on like the quick energy systems where you need like some sugars and things in your body to have instant energy. So there's such different style of trainings. I think this touches on how you were mentioning a lot of competition climbers don't go outdoors and climb, and vice versa. A lot of outdoor climbers don't go and do competitions. And I think it's because what they're doing, the training styles are so different. It's when you start, it's a little demoralizing going from something and being completely new when you're pretty good at something, right? Like no one likes that. And unfortunately, it is like quite a big difference. A lot of people, you have to train so differently, and a lot of people don't necessarily want to do both trainings. And it is counterproductive. One hurts the other. If you're switching back and forth, like if I train for comp stuff, it hurts my outdoor climbing. Vice versa, if I'm training for outdoor, it hurts my comp climbing. So I have to be very careful about when I end my phases, so that way I'm prepped for the next one to come up. And I think that's one reason a lot of people who focus on competitions don't want to sacrifice their training time and their performance in the comps, and vice versa. Like it's actually like a big mental head game when you're like, I'm doing 40 minutes in the roof or whatever. Like it kills you to like start to drop because you're doing something else. You got to pick your battles and what you want to excel at. And I think it can be done in both realms, but it's not easy. You have to have a very good understanding of the training that you're doing, why you're doing it, when you're doing it, and how to best manipulate the time frames that you're doing it so it doesn't hinder your performance in either.
Do you like the seasonality of doing both comp climbing and outdoor climbing? And the follow-up question is like, what's keeping you in the comp climbing scene?
I just love it. I think coming from like a competition background in cycling and nursing, I'm a very competitive person, I guess. Like I can be kind of harsh on myself, but I just like it. And I was doing rock climbing competitions too, and, you know, kind of dabbled in all of these things. And ice climbing, the community is fantastic. Like everyone's there helping, even though we're competing against each other. Like if I'm in finals in a World Cup or at the World Championships, I'm still talking with the other competitors being like, what hold do you think? Do you think you're going to do this on that move or whatever? And like, they're not there trying to like hinder your performance or sabotage you. They're actually trying to help. You know, we're like, oh yeah, I think we're going to do this or that. And it's just such a fun community where everyone wants to excel. And I think that's what's kept me involved in competition climbing. I just love the competitive aspect of it, as well as comp climbing. You get one shot, you know, and show what you can do. And if you botch it early, that's it. So it's really like the ultimate test of like your skill level, being able to move quick and apply all these different things. I have the power endurance, I have the knowledge and the technique to be able to just jump on a route I've never been on and do it. And I'm going to have the energy and the fitness to go and keep doing moves over and over, and even if something goes wrong. And I really like applying all of those skill sets together. And then outdoor climbing, I like that I'm able to actually project and physically go to my limit. Competition climbing, as I mentioned, you got one shot, one go, and stuff happens. Like sometimes you pop and you can't actually show what your true potential was. Where projecting and going doing these outdoor routes, I can actually try to find my body's physical limit, which I really enjoy. And I think that's what gives me the drive to do both. And let alone like who doesn't like going and climbing with their ice tools in summer with some palm trees and flip flops? Like it's kind of the dream. So yeah, I do enjoy the different seasons of it and being able to do both still.
Drytooling in summer and flip flops is like just the most contrived form of climbing.
Some would say the purest form of climbing, right?
I should be more kind. I should take the Midwest approach. That sounds great.
Just kidding.
I just want to like, how much time does this take you per week? Like how much time are you devoting to training? I know obviously you have periodization, so things are sort of crescendoing and then you're coming down. But on an average, how many hours are you putting into training?
You know, climbing's funny because, you know, with a cardio sport, you can be like, I did 18 hours this week. And it's literally, you worked out 18 hours. Like, you know, you were constantly going or whatever. Training for climbing, I'm sure as many people know, is different because you spend 60% of your time sitting on a bench on Instagram, and then you get up and do your, your interval. And
that's where you put together all those awesome reels.
Yeah. So, when I'm too lazy to get up and do my interval. But for time frame, when I usually go into the gym to train, I'm usually at the gym 3 to 5 hours. So it's pretty long, but it's because you need long recoveries for outdoor comp climbing. Like for me to do a couple burns, I'll do like a 30, 40 minute burn in the roof, but then I have to rest like 30, 40 minutes and I can do it again or whatever. And I'll do some cool down stuff and some core work and everything. And depending on the phase, it's different too. So it's not uncommon for me to be at the gym for hours, and that's pretty tough. And depending on the phase as well, the more endurance side of things that you do, your body, it takes more time to recover from. So like in my later phases endurance, before I go on these trips, I'll do one super long day of burns, and then I need 2 days to recover if my body isn't like ready to go again. So then I'll like go run or do other things. So it's hard to put an actual time number on it. And then when I'm in my earlier phases, in the base phase, I'm doing like a 3-hour day, and I'll do it 5 to 6 days a week. And it's lower intensity, high volume. So you're just getting your body ready for the load it's about to take. So depending on the phase it trains, but they're pretty heavy training phases. Competition climbing, the power side of things, you recover a little bit quicker from, but I find that I, in general, on average, need at least 2 rest days, if not more, a week. And when I was younger, it was easier for me to recover, just kind of go straight through. But I'd also like to think that I've gotten smarter and finally started to listen to people's advice, and like rest is key, But I think comp climbing, I need a minimum of 2 days off for training and endurance stuff. If I'm in the heavy endurance phase, I need 3 or 4. And if I'm in a base phase, then I take 1 or 2. And big days.
I imagine your arc training probably doesn't look like the typical climber's idea of arc training, because that would be sub pump, very sort of like continuous movements, but slow. Like you're not getting pumped. There's been a lot of blowback against arc training from what I understand, because it doesn't necessarily emulate climbing at a grade that you want to be applying it to, because to not have pump, you have to be basically on jugs. And I guess climbing on tools is a little bit like climbing on jugs, but not in a roof. And so I'm wondering, because you have such a strong and long base for climbing, like, do you think your arc training is different? Like you said you don't get pumped after 40 minutes. And so I guess I'm just curious, like, do you have context for that? Like compared to maybe some of the other roof trainers out there? That sounds funny to say.
Arc training has had ups and downs from like professional standpoints of coaches of like, yes, this is beneficial, and no, this is not beneficial. And I think from the general public, a lot of people do it wrong. It's extremely difficult. The climbing itself isn't actually like difficult. What's difficult is staying in the right level of exertion through it to make it beneficial. I think it is pretty proven to work if it's done correctly. However, I bet 95% of people do it wrong. I think people use it for the wrong intention. People are using it to gain more endurance, and that's not how you gain more endurance. Climbing longer actually will hinder your performance and your endurance over time, which is why you need those 2 days off. Where you actually gain endurance is from strength training. The more muscle that you have, it's going to require you to use a smaller percent of that muscle to do the same movement, which in turn is burning less, like for layman terms, like less energy, and you're producing less gunk, and you can hang on for longer, essentially. So strength training is actually where you get endurance from. Arc training is focused on working a different energy system and teaching your body how to utilize that energy system. I think that's where people are like, oh, I did this arc training and like I got super pumped, and now the next day I can't hang on, or like next week, and you literally just dug yourself a hole. You went way too far into the pump scale. Like the idea is, if you think about it from an endurance side of training, is like, let's say you went for a run and we have like a lactic threshold where you can only hold that for a few minutes and your body like tanks out on you. Like you get that burning sensation in your legs. Well, you want to sit just below that where you can talk with someone while you're going, but it's hard, like you're breathing hard. And that's kind of where you want to sit. If we think of a 1 to 10 scale of pump, where 1, it's like you don't feel anything, to 10, you can't even close your hand kind of thing. You usually sit in that like 4 to 5 where it's kind of uncomfortable, but as soon as you quick shake your hand, you're like fine again. The other thing that people do is they often do this on something that is so mind-numbingly easy that it's bad for your technique and actually starts to build bad habits. So you need to find routes that are engaging enough that still require you to use your brain. And it's okay to like go a little bit past it. Like you can get into like a 6-7 for a second, but you have to instantly get back like to somewhere where you can rest for like 5 seconds, and get back down to like a 4 or 5. And it's really hard to actually do that correctly. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong, and they just go like, oh, I got super pumped, so I got a good workout in, and it's actually counterproductive. And so ups and downs. And as I mentioned with that, I think the bigger things that you'll obtain, like I did do a lot of just straight up arc training on like a vertical to 20-degree wall my first 2 years for my base training, because it does help get your body ready for the larger amount of strain that's going to be put on it in the coming phases. And you do get benefits out of it. And part of that is also just teaching your muscles how to function, though. Like you have a lot of muscle and you have to teach your brain how to send signals to get it to work correctly. And that does it too. So it's not so much that you're just like actually gaining endurance, but you're actually just teaching your muscles and your neurological system how to actually fire all those muscles. So there's like different benefits of it. But as I mentioned, to gain actual endurance, it comes from strength training, like hangboarding, tool hangs and stuff like that. And actually building muscle mass like in the forearms and stuff, as opposed to like just climbing forever. I think people just use it incorrectly and have a misconception of what it's supposed to be used for.
What's next for you?
I have some plans. I'm going to bolt a new route here this summer and highlight that I'm stoked on. It's going to be kind of silly, but it's more or less a route for me to train on up at the Bingo Cave. It's going to end up being like 90-meter route. It's kind of silly, but it should be fun. My ultimate goal is to train for the new route that Matteo put up. It wasn't quite ready to go when I was there on this last trip. So yeah, tough times. I have to go back to Italy and try another route. So
oh yeah, boo-hoo.
Yeah, but I'm pretty stoked on that. And then I'm qualified for the USA ice climbing team again for this coming season. So I plan to do more ice climbing competitions, and I'm hoping to continue to grow. I love teaching, so I want to keep going back to the ice festivals and instructing there, but I also hope to keep mentoring and teaching in Bozeman, Montana, as well as others around. I just kind of want to share the knowledge. Like this really wouldn't all be possible without mentorship and without my mentor, Marcus Garcia's knowledge and, willing to help me. So I'm trying to do the same in our community, and hopefully this year I can do the same. And, I like to invite people on these trips just to see like if they're into it and like, go try hard and see what it's like. And yeah, so I'll travel to competitions, hopefully keep teaching around the country and trying my hardest, scratch and dangle upside down.
Nice. I got away from this question. I was doing it for a while and then I just stopped. I don't know why. If you were to give yourself, so you can tell it's been a while since I've asked it. If you were to give your younger self one piece of beta, which could be for climbing, it could be for life, it could really be for anything, what would that be?
I would say 2 things. Listen to your mentors. When they say you need to rest and your body needs the rest, it's true. Everyone's like, myself included, I've overtrained before. I haven't taken time to rest. I'm like, no, I'm fine. I can go do this. And it ends up resulting in injury and burnout. So I'd say make sure that you're having fun with it. If I could look back at it now, because I actually got in a pretty dark place with my climbing where I was so solely basing my performance and worth as a climber off of my performance of what I was climbing and how I was placing results, that it actually was starting to ruin the sport for me. And understanding that what actually makes me proud and the enjoyment of my climbing is if I did my climb well. So yeah, just having fun with it and being proud of my climb itself and not so much how it results. You can be proud in a climb. Like let's say you do a competition, you're last place, but you're happy with what you did and you were able to utilize things you worked on. You should be proud of that. And I think that's something now that I'm starting to understand more. So don't put too much stake in your results in the grade or anything. Just make sure you're having fun. It's a goofy sport. Like just go enjoy it, have fun with friends, enjoy where you're climbing, like enjoy nature. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. Looking back at it now, I wish I hadn't spent all those years making a self-worth for myself of, result-based acknowledgement.
Well, now I have to ask the follow-up question. You don't strike me as a particularly judgmental person of others. And maybe you do secretly inside, you just don't let it out. I'm surprised and not surprised that you would be so maybe self-critical or self-evaluative. I mean, you mentioned it when you were bicycle racing. How did you work through some of that like self-criticism? Like what was the process like to sort of reframe how you were relating to the sport?
Yeah, going back to it, from my biking days and everything, as I mentioned, you put stock in how you perform. And bike racing is literally you're getting a numerical value on your performance. And that's hard. And as a kid, you're taught performance is everything. Like, I mean, you want to be the best, you got to be up there in the higher rank. And
that also does seem a particularly American thing too.
Oh, very, very. And like, it's crazy to see traveling now and having the opportunity to like experience different cultures. Like, yeah, that's definitely a very American viewpoint. And yeah, it's hard. It puts an unhealthy mental load on people and expectation, especially for youth climbers. Something like with Wilson, who I'm mentoring here, I'm trying to make sure that all of our training's for fun. It doesn't matter how we compete, more or less that the competition's fun and you're proud of how you climb during it. And then to take in the full experience of like where you're at. We get to go these amazing places and go climb. Like, that's so cool. That's the things you should be taking stock in rather than like, oh, this one competition that no one's ever going to remember I did bad in. Like, why should that detrimentally wreck my identity? And that's tough. So in 2019, I had an amazing season. I was so stoked. But I made a silly mistake in one of my next comps after making finals in semifinals in China. And it like destroyed me mentally. I was like, what? How did I fall there? Like, I made a mistake. Like, what happened? I was so confident, and it just shook my confidence so bad that my results, I was climbing very slow and hesitantly the rest of the competition. I was doing worse and worse because I was putting so much stock. I'm like, I can't mess up. I don't want that to happen again. And people were coming up and asking me like, what's going on? You had such a great start to the season. Like, you're kind of climbing like shit. What happened? Like, it was really hard. And I had to keep explaining to people like, I know, like, I'm going to come back. Like, don't worry. Like, it's fine. It really messed with me. And I started hating, like, it was just so much pressure. Like, I really hated it. And I was putting so much stock in myself and being like, I need to train harder. I need to do this and this. When I came back, because 2020 with like Rona and stuff, and it was actually as bad as it all was, it was a nice mental break for me to be away from it. And when I came back, I didn't really train much. I was like, I'm just going to go climb for fun. And it was huge. I was like, whoa, I'm actually climbing way better than I was before. And I like have zero cares right now about how I do. Like, this is kind of crazy. And I realized how big mental training is. It was something I had always neglected. I'm like, no, physical training, that's what makes you stronger. That's what makes you better. And actually, a lot of climbing is just mental training and your attitude towards it. And Gordon MacArthur recently recommended a book. He's been focusing on mental training heavily, The Champion's Way. And that was super awesome. I started reading a bunch of different books on mental training. I found it so interesting. You can literally trick yourself into like having confidence and like getting yourself to believe. And Tyler's actually a big advocate for this as well. And his wife, I think one of their big quotes is like, doubt is poison. And that's true. If you start to put these negative thoughts in your head, you believe it, and you're going to hurt your own performance. And understanding that like you are capable, like this is fun. Like, why are you actually out here? Like, just remember you climb best when you're having a good time and like things like that. So I think the mental side of this and training, it makes such a big difference. And now that I'm actually like doing that and not putting all my self-worth into like my results, I'm getting better results and I'm enjoying it more. So that's one thing I try to instill in people is like, don't be discouraged if it's not going how you want it right now. Like, just make sure you're having fun. And, the best climber, I think what the quote is the one having the most fun. I do think it's true. And you're going to excel more at the sport if you're enjoying it rather than like, oh, I have to go to the gym and do my training today. Like, this sucks. Like, you're not going to get the best quality training you could get out of it. So you're not getting the physical benefits and you're like digging yourself a mental hole. And that really sucks. And yeah, I think people just need to remember why they're actually doing it and have fun with it.
We'll end there. Thank you very much, Kevin. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Yeah. Thanks so much for the time and having me on. This is amazing. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you. If you'd like to follow along with Kevin's latest latte creation, his ice axe juggling or climbing, you can follow him on Instagram at Lindlau Kevin, all one word. Lindlau is spelled Lindlau. We are also planning a training episode with Kevin and a few others. So if you have questions from today, send me a DM on Instagram and we'll include it in the conversation. Thanks for listening and see you next week.